Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome on the show former Associate Professor of Genetics and Genomic Sciences at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and the President and Co-founder of Bevimi, Jole Dudley. Now, in this conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from his journey into the world of computing, bioinformatics, the exciting innovations within AI for human health, supplementation, immunotherapy, debunking myths around the COVID outbreak and the vaccinations, combating Alzheimer's, cognitive health, the importance of sleep, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of over 1,200 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I introduce to you Jole Dudley. Enjoy. Well, Jole, I want to start by saying two things. Firstly, thank you to our mutual friend, Tom Paz, for making this connection. And secondly, I want to welcome you today onto the Behind the Shield podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Where on planet Earth are we finding you this afternoon?
I live in a small town called Louisville, Colorado, which is just outside of Boulder, Colorado.
Brilliant. Well, I would love to start at the very beginning of your timeline, then we'll work through. Where were you born? And tell me a little bit about your family dynamic, what your parents did, how many siblings?
Oh, interesting. I was born in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Sheboygan is a city that's sort of, if you draw a line from Milwaukee to Green Bay, it's kind of like right in the middle. And it's got a funny name because Wisconsin has a lot of Algonquin Indian names for cities. But I was my parents, my mom stayed home. My dad was a factory worker, but he was always interested in, science and science fiction and stuff like that. And I'm the oldest of 3 siblings, and we're all sort of 1 year apart.
What was he working as far as the factory?
He worked at a company called Bemis, which makes all kinds of stuff from like lawn furniture to toilet seats. And I think he made toilet seats for the majority of his career. So he was a blue collar dude. So
with that love of science and science fiction, was there a drive for him to be an entrepreneur or an inventor?
I would say not my dad, really. He's just a very curious guy. And then, I was born naturally curious, and he, was sure to, and we grew up quite poor, I would say. And, but, I showed an interest in computers. He would find a way to get one so I could program them, and, science fiction books and, my mom too. But, my dad was the kind of Isaac Asimov, reader, and would share that stuff with us. But I'd say he himself was not very entrepreneurial. He was just kind of a hard worker kind of guy.
What about sports and exercise? What were you playing in the school ages?
I was actually a wrestler for a lot of my career or my life. And actually in Wisconsin, people may know, like Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa, big wrestling states. So started when I was quite young, got quite good in high school. I actually went to state and was on the path, to win the heavyweight division for the state. But then I ended up, if I remember correctly, the guy who ultimately eliminated me was I ended up placing in state, but it was the Wisconsin heavyweight judo champion who ended up taking me out. But I'm 6'5", I'm 6'6", 250 pounds, so I'm an unusual heavyweight. So I'm quite tall, but it was one of my favorite sports. And then football as well is one of my favorite sports.
A lot of high performers have had on here, whether in the military or other areas. Wrestling was one of the sports that they
Yeah.
played, and a lot
Oh,
of people
interesting.
talk about the mental toughness needed in the mat room, needed in weight cuts.
Yeah.
What did you pull from that sport that served you later in life?
Well, it's an interesting sport, which people don't realize. I think if they don't understand it, is it's a huge mental game. You're doing a huge amount of processing in real time because while you're planning your next move, you're trying to guess what, you're planning a move, you're wondering how they might counter it. You're kind of planning 3 or 4 steps ahead, but it's a real time match. And, you're going for, it depends on the type of wrestling, but, the periods are short, but they're 110%, so you're going full bore, for a very short period of time. And I can't think of another sport that taxed me physically and mentally simultaneously more than wrestling. And I think that mental part of it's underappreciated.
What about on the academic side? Obviously, you found yourself on a high level in the computer world. Were you naturally gifted in the maths and some of those areas?
Yeah, but yes, but I was a very poor student. I will say, I got bored quite easily. I was the kind of kid who would just like read physics books for fun, but then not do my homework because I thought it was boring. So I was quite, admittedly a poor student, which I figured I sorted that part out later in life, and ended up getting my PhD at Stanford and stuff. So, but so I naturally gravitated towards science, physics, math. It came pretty easy to me, but I think that's, yeah. My dad had some aptitude for it, but I think also, like, if you're deeply interested in something, and spend a lot of time on it, things start to come easy. But I just feel grateful as I gravitated towards the sciences and quantitative type things.
You hear some people that are gifted struggle in school, and the origin is probably that they weren't challenged enough. Was that the case in yours?
Yeah, I would get bored, and I would often listen. I'd be sitting in class, like reading a book, while the class is going on, and kind of paying attention to both, but then not wanting to. I think if I understood something in my immaturity, I just didn't want to waste the time proving I understood it, and that was annoying to me. And that was when I was young. And then as I got older, I learned how to suck it up and do what you got to do to go through the hoops, and then sort of try to do better on tests and stuff as a challenge. But I think a lot of boredom was what drove my poor grades, and obviously didn't have. I have ADD and I have OCD, and my dad also had OCD. So like a combination of that but the OCD is like hyper focus, which I wouldn't give up my OCD for anything because it's one of my superpowers. So.
As you sit here now in 2026, we're going to talk obviously about the product that you guys have developed, and your journey into computing and AI, etc. If you were king for a day, what would you change about the education system to empower young people in a spectrum of learning styles to find their true paths?
Oh, that's a great question, man. We could spend hours on that, but I would say it's to be that the math that accelerates video games is the same math that accelerates AI models, right? So you can't be very prescriptive. You got to let people sort of follow, what interests them. But I think on a more personal level, as people follow their curiosity, they will acquire the requisite skills to pursue it further. Meaning, if someone's deeply interested in physics, they will probably be driven to acquire the mathematics skills, that would, allow them to pursue their. Maybe I'm focusing too much on science-based things, but the physics that they want to pursue, I think people kind of will acquire what's necessary and won't be too focused on narrow niches, if that makes sense. So sorry, that's sort of a digression, but it's a topic I'm quite interested in, and I'm trying not to talk about it for 3 hours.
No, well, firstly, feel free to tangent as much as you want. That's why these conversations are longer.
Okay, great.
I mean, I lived that though. I was a C student in school, and then when I found the fire service, finally, excelled. I'm not saying that I was,
Yes.
some incredible student, but compared to the C's that I was getting A's in EMT and medic and
Yes.
all those areas. And it was just like you said, it made sense to me. It was in a language that I
Yeah.
could understand. It was didactic in this particular case. So yeah, obviously I found the learning style and the desire to put in the work when the goal actually made sense to me.
Yes. Yes. No, I think, and it just like one final comment on the education system. Like you see the same mistakes being made because I brought up AI. Like my kid's school is doing everything they can to ban AI from school, which I think is completely the wrong thing to do. And if you go back through history, you see this mistake being made over and over again. For example, when calculators came out, everybody freaked out and they said, "Oh man, if we let people use calculators, everybody's going to the part of their brain that does math will completely atrophy, and nobody will know how to do basic math, without their calculator." And obviously, that not ended up being true because the AI is going to be around, calculator is going to be around forever. AI is going to be around forever, and we should be allowing kids to embrace that technology as much as possible, use it in every way possible in every class, and allow their brains to adapt, to the technology, so that they can do things with it that people my age or our age can't do. But they're again, the schools are making the same mistake they did with calculators with AI, and it's just like very frustrating to see.
Where is that balance? Because I've seen some, I think it's countries that have removed computers from the classroom. And I don't think in that case it's anti-AI. It's more trying to go back to real books again in some of the areas of learning. So where
Right.
would that balance be?
I think you're probably talking about some, I don't know if it's Scandinavian countries or whatever, that removed computers from the classroom and then got better results on tests and things like that. But then I would say, well, what are those tests measuring? Maybe that outcome is not relevant, to for example, the overall intelligence, the development of the intelligence or the knowledge of the students. It's just reflecting, a test. So I would want to go back and look at that. And I'm not an expert in that as much as I'm interested in that area. But I think, there's no limit to which, human brains can adapt to technology. This is another tangent, but there's something that Alan Turing proved, famous computer scientist, and then was further proved by, again, my hero, David Deutsch, which is called computational universality. What that means basically at a high level is that, the laws of physics essentially allow for the creation of computers that can simulate all of physics. And this is like a fundamental, feature of our physical world. And it looks like human brains are universal computers, meaning that our brains can calculate any algorithm that can be computed. However, we're limited by primarily our memory capacity in terms of how fast we could calculate an algorithm. But there's no algorithm that exists because our brains are universal computers. And I could go into why we know our brains are universal computers. And universal computer is a very specific thing, like I said, that can essentially calculate any algorithm that can simulate almost any aspect of the physical world, or any algorithm that could be computed in our universe. But we're limited by our memory. But that's fine because we've always found ways to augment our memory. So first was pencil and paper. Actually, before that, it was like sheep herders counting sheep, and they had like this rope system with like beads, that they would like run up and down the rope to keep track of the sheep and stuff like that. But we had abacus, then we have pencil and paper, then we have the computer, then we have the phone, and I think AI is just the continuation of that basically like cybernetic augmentation of our memory system, and it just will allow us to process more knowledge and compute more things that our brains are already capable of computing, but they're rate limited by our hardware memory limit. So I would say, I guess the answer to your question is like, I think no limit. I wouldn't put any limits on it.
I'm not sure as well in those examples if they just
Yeah.
removed the computer where it was a specific subject that you could use books. So, for example, English,
Right.
and maybe getting them writing again and reading real paper books, not the computing side of their education, I would assume. But, well, going back to schools then, as you were in the school age, what were you dreaming of becoming?
Funny enough, I have this not paper, but like I think in sixth grade we had to write about what we wanted to do. I still have the piece of paper. My mom had kept it, and in sixth grade, I apparently wrote that I wanted to be a geneticist, and that's what I ended up being effectively. Although I do computer science and genetics, ended up being my background. But yeah, I became a professor of genetics eventually, and I don't know why. I knew back then in sixth grade why, even if I knew what genetics was and why I wanted to be a geneticist, but I have the piece of paper still.
Were you reading books beyond your age, though?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, probably came across something then.
Yeah, I'm sure I came across a sci-fi where people were being genetically engineered or something like that. And I found it. I knew I always liked health and biology, and I always liked computer science, and just found a way to put them together.
So talk to me then about bioinformatics. What is that field?
That field is basically as our ability to measure biology improved. So imaging techniques, also obviously DNA sequencing being a huge one, which DNA sequencing technology allowing us to measure many different aspects of biology, not just the static DNA that's in the cell, but measuring RNA, which is how genes are being expressed in the system, and all different kinds of ways we're using now DNA sequencing to measure biology. But that generated a huge amount of information, and it became apparent that we would need computer science and statistics and math to sort out what the data was telling us and move away from the staring at cells in a microscope to using computers as our microscope to understand biology. And however, biologists were not traditionally trained deeply in mathematics and statistics and probability and machine learning and things like that. So the field was born to educate that next generation of scientists who had deep expertise in both. And I was just lucky that I had the interest in both and sort of got involved in the education, graduate level education at the time where this was becoming a big thing.
And where was it at that point when you first entered? Where was the technology?
I mean, a lot of it was just trying to understand sequencing data and coming off very rudimentary types of sequencers, meaning like sequencing the DNA sequences, not only of humans, but of different species. And a lot of the initial bioinformatics was around what's called alignment algorithms, because basically what the DNA sequencers would produce they couldn't sequence a whole genome sequence in one shot. And obviously DNA sequences this pattern of ATGs and Cs that people might have seen in movies or in school. They could only sequence very short reads. And then what you try to do, it's like a puzzle. You're trying to assemble the whole sequence from the short reads, but it's really, there's these just sort of random segments of ATGs and Cs, and you have to kind of know where they sequence together like a puzzle. And it's a pretty hard thing to do, especially if the reads are short, because the probability that, sequences look similar to each other, and you don't know if this one was left of this one or right of that one. So a lot of bioinformatics was focused on that. And then also a lot of bioinformatics was focused on cross-species sequence comparisons. So imagine we had sequences of viruses. How could you create a phylogenetic tree, right? Like an evolutionary looking tree of different viruses, and understand how viruses evolved or how species evolved, or bacteria and things like that. So it was really sequence oriented mathematics, but it's very, it encompasses much more than that today, but that was the early stages. And I did some work in evolutionary biology and things like that before I got into human health.
Were you around, was that during that early time when they cloned Dolly the sheep in the UK?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that was a big deal. I remember that. Yeah, I was working kind of in the space at that time.
Sheep look a lot alike, though. So I was questioning, how do we know that Dolly is really an ideal match for Dolly?
Well, you can sequence. And I think what we have learned from cloning experiments of, I think it's cats, where we've got a great first example of this. Someone had cloned a cat where the fur pattern of the cloned cat was quite different than the cat, that it was cloned from. And then it turned out that, there's an environmental influence in coat patterning. There's either some stochasticity or randomness in how that was patterned. And I think there's potentially some environmental influences. And the one thing we know now, obviously, is that, the DNA is one thing, but there's things called epigenetics And there's other chemical modifications and other things that happen in the cells, post-translational modifications. I'll try not to get too jargony, where the environment can influence, how the DNA is expressed. And so just because you've cloned a person, or we haven't cloned a person yet, although I'm sure China has and not told anybody about it. But we clone mammals, that we still see pretty significant differences due to the environmental effects.
Epigenetics is a really interesting word, same as neuroplasticity, because when I was being taught, medicine, when I was en route to being a doctor and failed miserably on the prereq side, we were told, well, once a brain cell is dead, that's it. And, if you have alcoholism in your family, that's it. And then become a firefighter, get into this space now, listen to all these experts, and all of a sudden, I'm sure we'll get to neuroplasticity, but yes, the brain can rebuild, can heal to a point, can relearn. But then on the epigenetic side, I think this is a really important conversation. I really want to get your take on it. The doom and gloom message that your parent was an alcoholic, therefore you are doomed to become an alcoholic, I think is irresponsible and wrong when it comes to the science. So either correct me or talk to me about that, the ability of the environment to affect positively on things that were presumed to be ingrained prior.
Yeah, and for many of these so-called genetic traits, you have to look at what's called the heritability, right? So something may be heritable, but the proportion of it that's explained by genetics may be as low as 10%, right? So yeah, it's genetic, but 90% of the variance that we observe in the population is explained by environment and 10% by genetics, and different genetic traits have different heritability. Some genetic traits have extremely high heritability. There's some autoimmune diseases. I think type 1 diabetes has very high heritability, for example, and some things like that. But the majority of genetic traits have lower heritability, and there's all different kinds of ways, obviously, that the both genetics and environment can interact. So one of the things that's a bigger deal. So we used to look at DNA risk markers like BRCA, famous, the breast cancer gene, right, and which increases your risk of getting breast cancer. There's ApoE4, which maybe we'll talk about, or ApoE gene, which we'll talk about maybe later because it affects Alzheimer's. And there's an E4 version of that gene. If you have 2 copies of E4, you have very high risk of getting Alzheimer's. But now there's an appreciation for what's called polygenic risk. And what polygenic risk means is, you may have this one, well-known risk marker, but there may be an accumulation of lots of other small genetic markers that will modify even that genetic risk, right? Because you could have inherited a combination of other genetic markers that have small effect on their own, but in aggregate may modify the risk of the one big genetic marker that you have. So even genetically, you may have this hard-hitting gene, but other genetic factors, or even just like personal mutations that you acquired through errors in how your the sperm and egg combined and things like that could modify that risk. And then environmentally, there's a whole host of things that can affect how the genes are expressed. Just to remind people of how DNA is stored, right? You have these it's stored in this chromatin packaging. It's just amazing. It's the basic stuff you learn in biology, but every time I think about it, I'm just totally amazed because you have the spool and thread, right? You have the DNA is wrapped around these histone proteins, and then the histone proteins are all so you got the spool and thread, and then the spools and threads kind of wrap up in the structure of this clump of these compact sort of spool and thread, where these DNA is wrapped around histone proteins, and then they form this big tightly packaged structure called chromatin. But that whole thing can unwind, super fast, and you can express genes that you need to express, right? It's just amazing that there's some system that we don't fully understand. I mean, we understand a lot about it, but that, we can unwind this very compact representation of our DNA and express genes. But there can be chemical modifications, DNA methylation, for example, that occur. That's what I call epigenetics. It's above the epi means sort of above, right? The genetics. So there's chemical modifications that can happen that affect the chromatin structure, the local unwinding, how certain transcription factors are proteins that attach to the DNA and transcribe the RNA to express the gene, to turn it into a protein. So there's these chemical modifications that can sit on top of the DNA, is one way to think about it, that will determine if, although you may have the DNA for a gene, it'll determine if it's expressed or not. And there's all kinds of things that can affect that. Some of it can just be environmental factors. You get exposed to a toxin or whatever that causes a chemical modification. Some of it is if things get more or less expressed. Like one example is in muscle. Let's talk about performance, right? Like if you work out a lot, there's been studies that have shown that there's epigenetic modifications, I believe, that occur in your muscle cells where they kind of remember that you used to do a lot of heavy weightlifting, so that if maybe you've stopped for a long time, but if you start again, that memory will be imprinted on those muscle cells' DNA, and then you'll come back faster and stronger than, say, someone who had never lifted before. Also in disease, we see it with eczema, where the skin can be inflamed, and then it resolves and it looks totally normal. But if you sample those skin cells and do like epigenetic or methylation profiling of those cells, you'll see the memory in those cells on that DNA that shows, we were previously inflamed and we're ready to go and be inflamed again faster than a normal skin cell if need be. So you'll see that imprinted on the DNA.
Johan Hari was on the show. He wrote a book recently on the GLP-1s. And he was explaining that it's the same in obesity, that there's almost a resetting of baseline in someone who's put on a lot of weight. So they're actually going against that baseline when they're trying to lose the weight after they've been obese.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's even another level of complexity. One of my expertise when I was a professor was multi-scale modeling. And this is the problem with trying to understand biology from genetics. I think people who are engineering minded might say, once we have the DNA, we should know everything that happens. But, we have DNA, and then inside the cell, just look at one cell. We have the DNA packaged. DNA is expressed as RNA. RNA gets expressed as proteins. Proteins start interacting with each other. There's just a whole universe of interactions inside one cell where proteins are interacting with each other, forming complexes. Then they're getting excreted. And then we have tons of different cells in our body, and then the cells themselves are like a network interacting with each other. And then you have organs, right? So it's all these layers of extraction. And one of my goals in my research lab was like, how do we model simultaneously all these different layers of abstraction so we understand how information flows from cells to organs up to the organism? And it's very hard. And the reason I'm bringing that up is with obesity, not only do you have these cellular components where there's certainly epigenetic factors and things like that, but then you have the whole metabolic system and all the organs talking to each other, and they get different set points, in terms of their network, and that network needs to be reset as well. So it's extremely complicated.
Touching on the alcohol for a second, if people listening now have grown up in a household with alcoholism,
yes,
I would argue the whole nature nurture conversation, usually in most left and right conversations, there's a little bit of both in the middle.
Yes.
There's definitely going to be an environmental element. If you grow up in a house where there was alcoholism, there's probably going to be some sort of trauma that then that child carries through into adulthood that might send them into drinking as well. Talk to me though about the epigenetics on that side. How much of that is you are doomed because your parent was, versus what is the potential for them to actually break that cycle and be the first generation that doesn't pass it on to their children?
Well, and you bring up a good point in terms of why it's so hard to tease apart these effects. I spent a lot of time also doing statistical analysis of what we describe as like observational data, right? Like you're doing this population level analysis, and you have a question, right? Like you have a question about a famous one is like a nutrition, right? Like nutrition studies are generally terrible because nobody's doing randomized controlled trials of nutrition, where they're locking people in a room and watching everything they eat. It's all self-reported. You're getting a big population where you don't know their true socioeconomic status, perhaps, and all these other sorts of things. So there's all these confounding effects. So it's the same thing with alcoholism, right? It's like you can't it's not ethical to run a randomized controlled trial on people who have certain genetic risk markers and then have them drink a certain amount of alcohol. So it's always hard to tease apart all these confounding effects, and it's unlikely that we have all the data we need, to really tease them apart in terms of what was happening in the home. And although we do know there are very large twin studies, and those ends up being our best resources for disentangling some of this stuff. So that and I haven't looked recently, but there are some pretty strong genetic markers for alcoholism. One of them being, I don't know what the exact genetics are, but it relates to the dopamine system, and I happen to have it. Where does alcohol calm you down, or does alcohol get you fired up? So for me, when I have a couple drinks, I want to get shit done. I want to code. I want to do stuff. I want to make stuff. And that turns out to be, my understanding of the psychology research, is a high risk alcoholism trait, where you get really wired. Alcohol for me is like coffee. I'm let's get stuff done. And ironically, coffee calms me down. But so there are some risk factors like that. But in terms of tangling, the social aspects, I think it's hard. I don't think we have a perfect answer to that yet in terms of how much other than twin studies. And I guess I would urge people to go look at the latest twin studies to see what the twin studies see in terms of how deterministic the genetics are in the alcoholism case.
If you had, I'm just hypothesizing now, if you had someone grow up in that kind of household and then they do the work, they process their trauma. Now they meditate, do breath work. They, have a beautiful home. They're very loving to their children. What is the impact of that on genetics if you start passing that forward 2 or 3 generations and you're breaking the cycle of trauma and you're trying to create an environment where people are physically and mentally working through whatever their challenges are, and therefore, I hate the word resilient, but trying to become a better version of themselves versus who they could have been if they'd been stuck in that cycle of trauma.
I think there's a couple of things to disentangle here. One is, and there are people looking at this sort of the epigenetic heritability of trauma. There's a woman, I used to be a professor at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York, and there's a woman whose name eludes me because I'm terrible with names, whose research is focused on that, I think looking at Holocaust survivors and things like that. And in fact, the dean of Mount Sinai School of Medicine, when I was a professor there, was this guy named Dennis Charney, who actually, I think, had the first patent on ketamine for depression. And he had studied the molecular basis of resilience, right? And he, I think, started working with the Hanoi Hilton, for Vietnam, POWs, and then looking at situations like, these 2 women were both raped around the same age violently. This person goes on to lead a relatively normal, healthy life. This person becomes, an alcoholic or a drug addict or whatever. But what are the molecular and neural correlates of, the resilience factors? So there's a lot of interesting work in this space. I'm not the expert, but there are some people publishing interesting epigenetic work there. Although I'm personally suspicious of the epigenetic signal, which ends up being, I think, really small. I think probably real, but very small. And I think probably if we had all the confounders, it would maybe not go away completely, but be very small. This sort of generational epigenetics, that would be my prediction, because you have other things to think about, right? Because the children of the parents are going to have different biology, and they're going to have different neural architecture, right? So there's a bunch of really bad personality models out there. Everybody's heard about them, but the one that ends up being somewhat useful is called the Big 5 personality trait, only because it is actually somewhat predictive of future behavior. And one of the traits in the Big 5 personality model is, and again, I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but I spent a lot of time looking at this because I'm interested in it, is there's sensitivity to negative emotions is one of the traits that they've done lots of big population studies on, and I happen to be extremely low in that trait, but I have family members who are very high in it, and then that would, for example, determine how sensitive you were to parental behaviors and things like that. So I guess, there's a lot of confounding effects there. So I think the epigenetic signal is probably real, but I think we just haven't been able to estimate it properly yet.
While we're on the topic of genetics, I think another perspective I think will be invaluable from you. We went through a pandemic, a few years ago
Yes.
now. And to me, the biggest tragedy was we came out the back end of that. There was no what we call tailbore critique, no analysis of what was done well, what wasn't, which messaging was correct,
Yes.
which was incorrect. So it's not a political conversation. To me, it's a lessons learned. How can we be better conversation? And I think that the state of the health of the nation is indicative of the fact that we didn't learn lessons, that we weren't working on the obesity
Correct.
and etc. So without loading the question, as we sit here now in 2026, what are some of the takeaways that you wish people did know about the viruses themselves and how they travel, etc. The impact of pre-existing health conditions on outcomes.
Yes.
And then if you want to touch on it, the mRNA vaccine and the efficacy of that too.
Oh, yeah, a lot of stuff. Happy to talk about all of that. So actually, on the sort of policies, and I'll just get on my soapbox and say, what happened. One lesson we should learn is that just because it's a pandemic, we can't silence scientific inquiry and critique. And I think what happened during the pandemic was just awful in terms of suppressing scientific inquiry and criticism, and which is what criticism. Coming up with conjectures and criticizing ideas is the core of science, and we shut all that down. And Jay Bhattacharya, who's now the head of NIH, he was a professor at Stanford when I was there, and I had met him. And there was the group that wrote oh my God, what's it called? They wrote a document. Oh, I can't believe I'm blanking on it right now because I bring it up all the time, but I'll think of it. But Jay Bhattacharya, a professor from Harvard, a professor from Oxford, and their names will come to me. I apologize. I'm coming off a cold and not thinking too well.
No
but
problem.
Martin Kulldorff, and I forget the woman who wrote one of the top software that was used academically to simulate pandemics and vaccines and stuff. There's a woman from Oxford, and they wrote a document, the Great Barrington Declaration is what it was called. And they basically said, and these folks were eminently qualified to comment on this. So Jay Bhattacharya, he is an MD who has also, I believe, a PhD in economics and was a professor at Stanford and studies health policy type stuff. And they basically said, hey, we should, if people have heard of precision medicine, they said we should practice. The Great Barrington Declaration basically said we should practice precision epidemiology and really use data and information and use our limited resources to figure out who's at higher risk and things like that. It was a completely reasonable statement by people who are quite well qualified to make such a statement, and they were pilloried, not only by their own institutions and their own faculty who they worked with, but obviously, folks at the NIH and other government bodies. It was, a great miscarriage of science. So we should learn from that, never do that again. And hopefully the fact that, Jay Bhattacharya is now at the head of the NIH is a good sign that he survived. I actually stopped donating to Stanford because of, how they treated him during that time. So I'll get off my soapbox there. But in terms of what we learned on policies, actually one of my grad school lab mates was a guy named Chirag Patel, who happens to now be a professor at Harvard. And he actually published a paper, which I can dig up, which was very interesting and got news and was actually, frankly, I think a really brave thing to publish. And he's really an expert in analyzing environmental data, observational data, sort of all the data that he actually did a lot of work on the exposome when he was a student, looking at environmental factors, how it affects the health of populations, but a true sort of data expert in analyzing all this sort of public data that's out there. And he published a paper, I don't know the title, I can dig it up later, but where he basically ran this very sophisticated simulation on all the different policies that were used by all different types of governments, around the world and in states. And basically the conclusion of the paper was that none of them had an effect on transmission whatsoever. These policies, and that's the type of work that needs to be done. And he published that paper, so people can go read that paper if they're interested in that. In terms of the effects of the policies, you asked me about something else, though.
Yeah, there's a couple of things.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I asked you three things in a row, which I never do normally. So that was a terrible way
No worries.
of asking questions.
Yeah.
The ability for a virus to spread, coming from a very low level scientific background as a prereq college major, and then a paramedic, a lot of the things that I was taught to be fundamental about the size and spread of viruses, what I was being told during the pandemic did not seem to match that at all.
Yeah. No, I mean, without getting, I mean, we know that a lot of the measures, the 6 foot thing was completely made up. Anyone that works in a hospital and sees, so when you work in a hospital and the infection control team, there's actually like a very sophisticated protocol for mask fitting for infection control if people have ever worked in a hospital. And the reason for that is because to get a mask to fit in a like if someone's going to go, obviously if someone's dealing probably with Ebola, there's a whole separate set of measures and equipment that people use, but it's extremely difficult to get the mask to work effectively in an infection control type setting, to the point where the hospitals have special protocols to do it, to make sure it's really working for these physicians who will take care of patients in those situations. So there's issues with what masks we're probably doing or more likely not doing. Outdoor transmission, we know, was basically almost never happened as far as we can tell. So, the fact that we forced everybody to stay inside, and that California was bulldozing sand into skate parks and things like that, and upon reflection, and again, I want to be charitable, because obviously there's things you can look in hindsight that look silly, and you have to try to remember what people were, what their intentions were during the fog of war of the pandemic, and what we knew and didn't know. So I don't want to be too harsh on those people, but we should have encouraged everybody to be outdoors and in parks and all that kind of stuff. And then I think you asked me about the mRNA vaccine, and what was the specific question?
Well, yeah, I mean, we were presented as that was the answer. And yet, again, I'm not extremely well read on this, but from what I understand, the efficacy was far from 100% when all was said and done.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We learned a lot. We still know so little about the immune system and how the immune system works. And I think we have overly simplistic ideas about what different aspects of the immune system does. B cells do this thing, and with regards to immune memory and antibodies, and T cells do this thing. And one thing we learned during the pandemic was that, T cells are much smarter than we thought. We already know certain subsets of T cells are really smart, but there was, I think it was people in Singapore and other places that had been previously exposed to a related, coronavirus, had a very strong immunity to the COVID-19 that seemed to be independent of antibodies and B cell activity. And basically, there's been research that's followed up on that, but our T cells seem to have some kind of memory and some kind of activity against viruses, and some intelligence that we didn't completely understand, right? So we sort of over-indexed on the old, you need antibodies, you need to prime the B cells and all, with a vaccine. And so that was interesting scientifically, that, the immune system does all kinds of stuff we didn't know. And COVID-19, revealed more of that to us, which was useful. And then the mRNA vaccine technology, the expedited development of that was interesting, because now it was actually originally developed for cancer vaccines. It was sort of the original goal, kind of repurposed for viruses, and we can talk about its use in viruses. But but all the investment that went into it is now pivoting back into cancer vaccines, and I think mRNA vaccines will be quite useful in cancer vaccine space, and we're seeing some interesting outcomes in some cancers now. But yeah, I think the efficacy, without spending too much time on it, it should have been reserved for the individuals with the highest risk. Um, Even the trials themselves had trouble sorting out, who had been previously exposed or not, and things like that. Children were at almost no risk whatsoever, from bad outcomes, like basically no risk, from severe outcomes, hospitalization, death, and things like that. And the big elephant in the room, which I think you alluded to, was of course pre-existing health conditions, and their effect. We knew early on in the pandemic that obesity was a huge issue in terms of morbidity, and obesity-related factors like type 2 diabetes, chronic kidney disease, things like that. But you kind of weren't allowed to talk about that because you wanted to treat everybody equally, and you didn't want to fat shame or whatever. But it put a huge, I think, target or spotlight on the fact that our country had not focused on prevention and health and wellness and things like that, and that was coming to roost in COVID in terms of who was the most at risk of death from life, basically like diseases of lifestyle and poor health and wellness, basically. So I guess there was it was sort of hard to all those different. I keep coming back to confounding effects. Like there's all these different confounding effects, right? That sort of made it hard to tease apart, especially in real time. The effects of the effects of the virus in terms of mortality, the effects of the vaccine, and then there's some, not without putting my tinfoil hat on too much or freaking people out too much. There was some interesting work done by some legitimate scientists that have published papers on in the early batches of the vaccine. There was a sort of rigor around how. So the way the mRNA vaccines get created, it's actually a modified RNA to make it, because RNA as a molecule is unstable. So you need to do some chemical modifications to it to make it a bit more unstable. And it's actually make it more stable. And it's called mod RNA. But that's actually kind of where Moderna's name comes from. I think it's a play on mod RNA, Moderna, because you have to modify the RNA chemically to make it more stable. And then those get expressed in, basically use bacteria, like sort of bioreactors to produce the vaccine. And there's some kind of genetic engineering that goes into that. And the early batches, I think, and each company did it kind of differently, but there was a group of scientists, with cautioning people not to get too freaked out about this, but that there was some contamination in some of the batches of vaccines in terms of levels of double-stranded DNA being higher than what was allowed by European and American regulatory standards. And your body doesn't, your immune system, there's certain types of things your immune system doesn't really like. There's certain types of double-stranded DNA that your immune system doesn't really like because it causes an inflammatory response. And then there's something called the SV40, simian virus 40 promoter, that's used to, which is, this promoter which promotes the expression of genes that's used in some of these bioreactor systems to express genes. And simian virus 40 is a virus that's known, for example, to cause cancer in humans. And there was some concern, and I'm not saying this happened, but there was some concern that leftover simian virus 40 promoter in some of the batches of the vaccine could potentially be causing some problems in the human biology. And there's a whole group of scientists that are investigating this and publishing it. And I don't want people to think that I'm saying that they got simian virus 40 and that's causing cancer or whatever. But there have been some concerns raised from the manufacturing process too, and maybe it getting more or less lax as time went on, and some contaminants that in certain batches that could be causing issues independent, because I want to bring that up because that would be independent of just the mRNA vaccine itself, these potential contamination issues, which is another confounder to try to tease apart here.
See, it's so interesting to hear someone who really knows what they're talking about pick that apart a little bit, because as you probably heard, when COVID happened initially, there were literally people I had heard from, ER physicians and paramedics that, literally were in a car accident and then their death was ruled COVID-19,
Right.
and then
Right.
conversely, the back end of the pandemic, now everyone, a guy gets admitted with an arrow in his head and it's like, oh, it was the vaccine that killed him. So it's like these two
Yeah.
extremes that do exist. I mean,
Yes.
there are these cases, but again, what is that middle ground? What are the nuances? Is it a safe vaccine? But like you said, the handling practices or the solutions that
Right.
they're in, were contaminated, or because I mean, I think it's an important conversation when these are forced on a population. It's different maybe if you chose to, because I mean, there was an
Right.
irony that people were so opposed to vaccines, but then had no problem with their statins and their beta blockers and everything else that they were shoveling down. But at the same time, yeah, if you are going to trust a product, then you should be told about the risks and myocarditis or whatever the elements that were really there, or higher prevalence of cancer that needs to be educated to the population before they then get the choice to take that vaccine or not.
Yeah. Yeah. No. That's why I was like, in medicine, literally everything is risks versus benefits. And that's why I try to remind everybody. Taking aspirin is risk versus benefits. There's no absolute solution for anything in medicine. It's risk versus benefits, and then the risks, can be modified by many different things. Your genetics, your pre-existing conditions, and so that's why it's so hard. And people don't like that, because I think people just want absolute solutions to things, right? And absolute answers. And nothing in medicine is like that, really. And or in life, really. Like one of my adages I like to say, which is a very nerdy thing that's hard to remember, but like, thou shalt not ascribe, univariate causes to highly multivariate phenomenon. What does that mean? Is like, people want like simple correlations, and simple univariate just means like one variable changing, right? They want, the mRNA vaccine was given or not given to explain everything that happened, but there's all these other confounding factors that we discussed that really are behind the reality of the situation. But everybody likes to see everything. The world is like XY plots, but the world is a lot more complicated than that. So
I want to get to brain health, and we will in just a moment.
Yeah.
Just one more area, but now we're on the health of the nation.
No problem. Yeah.
Cancer just seems so prevalent at the moment. Now, my profession, obviously, a lot of people are in the fire service, so everything from sleep deprivation from shift work to exposure to carcinogens, that's amplifying why my men and women are dying in droves. But even in the general population, you're seeing a lot of pediatric cancers, a lot of young men and women dying in their 20s. Through your eyes, what are these contributing factors that are seemingly escalating the numbers of people that are getting cancers or even dying from them?
It's a good question. It's very concerning. I've seen the data on it in terms of the population, sort of correlative data. I think we don't know the answer as to why, what the mechanistic reason is to why it's increasing. There's a paper that was just published recently as of like 3 days ago, which I could also dig up. But basically, they found a signature, and they're doing this. I alluded to before that my friend who's a professor at Harvard did this, what's called the exposome kind of research, looking at environmental exposures that affect health. Well, this wasn't a paper by him; it was a paper by a different group, but it was a similar approach. And they actually basically found a signature of this one, and I can't remember the name of it, this one particular pesticide that was started being used in the 60s, I believe, first. And they actually found, and I haven't read the paper in depth, but some sort of chemical or biochemical signature of that pesticide explaining some increase in colon cancer, I believe it was. So I have to imagine, because the increase is so recent and so steep, that it is, of course, environmental factors that are contributing to it. So hypotheses range from things like pesticides, whether they're just in the environment or obviously making it into our food, as well, to the other hypotheses around the quality of the food itself, right? In terms of highly processed foods potentially being more damaging to the brush border cells of the small intestines and things like that, and increasing inflammation generally in the bowels. I've seen some studies, which I don't believe around alcohol, because actually alcohol use is actually down among sort of Gen Z and those groups. So I don't see alcohol potentially as a big driver of that. But it has to be some combination of, pure environmental exposures. Who knows? Things leaching from plastics. Poor diet. It's probably highly multivariate, highly confounded, and there's probably a number of factors contributing to it. But it's super concerning.
You mentioned BRCA before, the gene for breast cancer. I know there
Yes.
was a big push, I think more so in the celebrities, where people were having the tests and getting a double mastectomy proactively. What is your perspective of that? Should the women listening be terrified if they have got this gene, or is it a death sentence, or is there more to it?
No. I think that falls in the category of hereditary genetic testing, and that's a hereditary genetic variant that you've inherited from your parents that increases your risk of getting breast cancer in this case. And there are a number of companies now that offer hereditary genetic testing, which I would, I've had a number of friends, unfortunately get cancer, and then you look at their DNA and the smoking gun was already sitting in their DNA. So the question is, what would you do about it? Well, in the case of breast cancer, obviously there are things like mammograms and ultrasounds and more proactive testing, or people, depending on the severity, doing prophylactic surgeries. But there are a number of new tests, blood tests, or early detection, multi-cancer early detection tests. One would be Grail Gallery, which is a blood test, which looks for, and now there's a bunch of other companies, and actually, I think LabCorp may have one, but there's another company that just announced one, which again I could dig up. There's so many different companies. I can't remember who just announced another multi-cancer early detection test. But Grail Gallery was sort of the first big one, and I get that test every year. And what that does is it looks for little bits of cell-free DNA. Cell-free DNA just means literally bits of your own DNA that happen to be floating around in your blood. And there's a number of reasons why that would be the case. Like, why would you just have random your own DNA floating around in your blood? Well, cells get damaged, tissues get damaged, and there's other processes that can contribute to you having cell-free DNA floating around in your blood. But what they actually do is they use DNA sequencing, and they look for what I mentioned before, these methylation patterns, these chemical modifications to the DNA, and they use a particular type of DNA sequencing technique to do that. So they look for the cell-free DNA, and the cell-free DNA is in very low quantities, so they have to try to amplify it, and then they sequence it, and they look for these signatures, these methylation signatures of cancers for multi-cancer early detection. So that would be, I think Guardant is the other company that has one. But anyway, I'll have to let everybody know for sure. But so that there are these multi-cancer early detection tests. There's other types of imaging tests. There's Ezra and Prenuvo, which are these sort of whole body MRI companies now that are using AI. So I would say, depending on the nature of the cancer, there's some cancers where these multi-cancer early detection tests don't perform well, where contrast-free MRI is not going to see them. So I don't want to let people think like, oh, if you get this MRI and this early cancer detection test, you're in the clear. That's absolutely not the case. It depends on the cancer. But for many cancers, there's now these sort of proactive early detection steps you could take if you had one of these sort of smoking gun heritable genetic factors.
Brilliant. I actually had a full body MRI with Prenuvo a few months ago, and I was very impressed. And then they said, when went through with the doctor at the end, they said, look, there's some that may not show up, but I mean, at least you're getting a pretty good look inside the body.
Yeah. And they have some, in my own personal network, and then obviously they share stories because of course they're incentivized to, but I know of an individual who was a never smoker, who had got lung cancer detected early by a Prenuvo, non-metastasized, completely removed, full recovery, and there was almost nothing that would have indicated this person should have lung cancer. But of course, there's other issues with these early detection things like MRIs. Doctors hate them because there's this sort of this concept of the incidentalome, which is sort of all these incidental findings that can be caught on an MRI, and maybe there's even harmful follow-ups, that people could get because they're too worried about a benign cyst that appears on their liver or whatever. So, it's another issue around these things. But I think as the Prenuvo and Ezra, EZRA is the other company, which was acquired, I think, by Function Health, the blood testing company. But as these companies build up larger data sets, I think the quality of their detection and interpretation will get better, especially with AI models.
Brilliant. Well, I want to move then to brain health. How did you even shift to wanting to study neuroinflammation and some of these other areas that we're going to talk about?
I got pulled into it, I would say accidentally. So as I mentioned before, like my lab's expertise is in this sort of multi-scale modeling. Like if you have data on what's happening in cells and proteins and organs, and how do you build data models that help us understand how information is flowing from the lowest level of the cells up to the organism level. And the NIH has had this program called the Accelerating Medicines Partnership for Alzheimer's Disease, and what they were doing at the time was funding a very large study where they're collecting deep DNA sequencing, proteomics, brain scan imaging, and a lot of deep data on Alzheimer's patients, really for the first time ever in terms of the breadth and depth of the data set that was being created. And that they recognized that they needed people brought into that study who could analyze all that data, And so we found our way into that world through our expertise in this multi-scale data modeling for biomedical data modeling. So we analyzed a lot of the data they were generating, and then we ended up sort of we built this kind of sort of like network models, and then we look at information flow in the biology, and we sort of let the data tell us like what's happening in the biology here, rather than having an a priori hypothesis that we try to enforce too hard on the data. But the punchline is we analyzed all the data, and there's a guy in my lab, his name is Ben Reedhead, a gentleman from Perth, Australia, who is now a professor at Arizona State University working with the Banner Alzheimer's Institute. He's done some interesting follow-up work here. But we found a very strong signal for this neuroinflammatory network or pathway centered around this cell type. These cells, there's a cell in your brain called the microglia, which are a specialized kind of immune cell of the brain, related to the macrophage, which is a cell outside the brain. But and we actually found this network where we could sort of show with our modeling techniques that a herpes virus, HSV1, and then also HHV6, another herpes virus, one way to think about it, we're agitating these networks, and we could see in the data driving changes that we thought were contributing to the Alzheimer's pathophysiology. So we published this paper in a journal called Neuron, which is a very well-regarded journal in the neurology field. At the same time, there's a Harvard group that was using, I would say, from my perspective, old school laboratory techniques with mouse models and being a bit more hypothesis-driven, which is, of course, totally fine. And they had, by luck, one of the guys we were working with was in contact with that group. And the group, it's a team led by Rudy Tanzi, who's a pretty famous Alzheimer's researcher at Harvard. And they found a signal also for HHV6, herpes virus 6, in their data. And what was really interesting about that was we took this very data-driven approach from human data. They took this very hypothesis-driven approach with mouse models, and we converged on the same virus. And that's very unusual for that to happen. And by the way, they found it about at exactly the same time. So we actually published back-to-back papers in the same journal where we had our approach, they had their approach, and it's centered around herpes virus 6. Now, this was extremely annoying to the mainstream Alzheimer's research community, which I didn't realize until we published the paper because I wasn't part of that community, because they're very focused on beta amyloid as the causal factor in Alzheimer's and targeting that. And we would get heckled at conferences when we talked about this work. And basically what had happened was, I think back in the 80s, I think in the 80s, a couple Alzheimer's researchers had seen some signals and thought that viruses could be contributing to Alzheimer's risk and Alzheimer's prevalence in the population. But I think the Alzheimer's field had felt that they had finally dispatched that hypothesis and killed it. And here these guys had just resurrected it, annoyingly. But we didn't even know about it. We were new to the field. We were just letting the data talk. But then and actually there was kind of an effort to suppress this alternative hypothesis. There's a news outlet called Stat News, STAT, and they're actually kind of one of the, I would say, premier news organizations that covers the world of biopharma. And they actually published a paper. I can't remember the title of the paper. I could dig it up, of course, but something about the title is something like the shadowy cabal of Alzheimer's researchers who suppressed alternative, theories for decades. And it's basically about, these very powerful researchers. And I think I believe I mentioned in that article, who, were trying their best to to suppress alternative hypotheses about the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's. But I would say the dam kind of broke on that. And then I ended up meeting Annalise Barron, who's involved. She's a professor at Stanford, who's also was focused on this sort of immune viral biology aspect of Alzheimer's and doing her own work. But now the evidence has started to pile up. So I think people have now looked at the NHS, the National Health System data set in the UK, which is a nice data set because basically you have the whole population of the UK in one database. And there are very strong signals for people who get the Shingrix vaccine, the herpes vaccine, having lower risk of Alzheimer's compared to people who don't. There's been some signals in other countries of antivirals lowering the risk of Alzheimer's patients and things like that. So I think eventually now the data's gotten too strong to ignore that. At least, the innate immunity that is related to viral biology plays a significant role in Alzheimer's. So that was a lot. I'll pause there for a second.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. The pushback from the Alzheimer's community was part of that because there were certain drugs that they wanted to make sure was still front of market.
I think it's, again, a combination of factors. I think people would be shocked. I was a professor. I published over 250 papers. I was a tenured professor. I know how the academic research, world works. I think people would be shocked at how much certain types of dogmatism can reign in certain subspecialties and things like that. And it's a combination of, think about it, like it's not necessarily that, oh, well, this professor gets a lot of money from this pharmaceutical company, therefore they're suppressing or they're trying to preserve this hypothesis. I don't think it's that so much as, scientists have egos. And if you've built your whole career around hypothesis, then sometimes people become, I think, dogmatic in preserving that hypothesis because they're the most famous person, for that hypothesis, right, around that hypothesis. And if that hypothesis goes away, then, they're no longer the most famous person around that. So, or whatever. So it's a lot of ego. And and perhaps some influence from the fact that there are these, like Leqembi and these anti-amyloid drugs, which frankly don't work that well, as, proved by a recent Cochrane review, which is a medical review of the latest, outcomes on certain medical interventions. But I think there are some people who wanted to make sure that these anti-amyloid drugs did get into the market. So at least there was some therapy. And if you're being charitable, I can understand why, because there's no therapies. They want some therapies to get out there. But unfortunately, it's a lot of ego.
I had Professor Russell Foster from Oxford on a couple of times. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he was the man who discovered the chronoreceptor in the eye. So when it comes to circadian rhythm, and the same thing, the ophthalmology world laughed him out of many a room. But like a lot of these people, he just kept kicking indoors, as he said, till people paid attention. And he showed it on rat models, and then they were like, "Oh, okay." But that ties into everything from my world with shift work through to veterans who lost their eyes in combat, and weren't able to have day or night, and they're developing a drug now to try and help those men and women, have some semblance of life, basically. So it's really interesting, like going back to neuroplasticity and epigenetics, is that
Yes.
If that's the sword that you're going to die on, and you don't have the humility to be open to innovation, it's the death of science.
Absolutely. And then, unfortunately it happens more often than not. And you usually, if you're on the right track with a really kind of paradigm shifting, not always, but sometimes you're just wrong. But oftentimes when you're on the track with a paradigm shifting approach, you're the number one thing you're going to face is rejection almost everywhere, right? Like you're not going to get published in Nature or Science or the top journals. You're going to get constantly rejected. I remember I published the first ever deep learning AI paper analyzing medical records. I ended up beating the Google team by like a year. And that paper got rejected like crazy because everybody's like, I don't know why you'd use AI for this. I don't understand. It's just like, so usually if you're early, you face on a new idea, you end up facing rejection, and you end up being way more lonely than you'd think. And everybody telling you you're wrong. But that's the fun part of science, right? You got to have the conviction to. And there's a number of examples from, the guy who discovered H. pylori, right? He had to drink it and give himself ulcers to prove to people that H. pylori causes ulcers. So
it's funny because I'm not a scientist at all, but beginning my education on sleep medicine and understanding how that was behind, our mental health problems, our cancers. I mean, not the only thing, but an amplifier of it. And then trying to get people to understand that the way that we're working, our firefighters especially, because they're doing 56-hour work weeks when they're understaffed, which is across the country now. They're getting what's called mandatory overtime. So now it's an 80-hour work week. And just making the case. It's not James Gearing saying, oh, this is my hypothesis. It's bringing all these great minds on to layer that case for. And it's working. Like the last couple of years or so, we got these departments actually making this positive change. But you use the word lonely. Yeah, you are absolutely on an island, and I'm sure down the road, people won't know anything about the origin story either. And that's fine. I'm happy to just, let the boulder run. But it is incredible when you've got these solutions and just almost no one wants to listen at the beginning.
Yeah, no, it's very common throughout the the history of science and many other areas, unfortunately, which is why it's not for the. Actually, it's why I think scientists don't often realize to make good entrepreneurs, because if you're in science and you're being a good scientist in terms of challenging orthodoxies and dogmas and trying to really progress the field, you're met with nothing but constant rejection. Your grants are being rejected, your papers are being rejected, and you got to have a thick skin. And same thing with starting a company. You're constantly getting rejected by investors and everybody telling you your idea is stupid. And but if you're a scientist, it's like, oh, who cares? I spent my whole life being told I'm wrong and stupid about everything. So
I can relate. Well, before we go to Bevimi, one more area while we're on the Alzheimer's conversation. I've heard a lot of people refer to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes. So talk to me about the correlation, if any, through your eyes, between the American diets and a lot of the neurodegenerative diseases that we're seeing at the moment.
It's a good question. I think we haven't totally disentangled the causality there, because we talked about it with COVID. One thing we know is that glucose control and diabetes and obesity and things like that really have a strong influence on your immune system and immune function. And by the way, so does, I was going to mention before, circadian rhythms. It's amazing. There are amazing papers showing the effect of circadian rhythms on your immune system, to the point where I believe there's papers on for cancer immunotherapies that, knowing where the person is in their chronological cycle, actually a circadian cycle, actually affects the efficacy of immune therapies in cancer. It's unbelievably powerful. But your metabolism, or the dysfunction of your metabolism, definitely changes your immune function. Also changes your epithelial function. So if I could do a quick related detour about the blood-brain barrier.
Please.
So the blood-brain barrier, this is another here, but this gets back to a problem of scientific dogma. One reason I think neuroinflammation is just becoming well understood as probably a driver of many dysfunction, neurological diseases, not just Alzheimer's and things like that, and multiple sclerosis, but even like things like treatment-resistant depression, was the fact that neurologists used to see the brain as this hermetically sealed organ that was so protected from the rest of the body that, and for good reason, right? Because, for example, it's hard to treat glioblastomas with drugs in cancer because the blood-brain barrier is a stout defense against things trying to get into the brain. That being said, what is the blood-brain barrier? The blood-brain barrier is this structure which is made out of this system, or these components, which is called endothelial glycocalyx. And what that is, you think of it as like these like sugary. I'm just talking about the chemical composition of them, but like it's like seaweed. Think of it like big seaweed structures that are hanging off your endothelium. It turns out, by the way, all your endothelial surfaces do have a bit of a glycocalyx, structure, I believe, but they're just at the blood-brain barrier, there's a very significant endothelial glycocalyx structure of these big seaweed type things. It's really cool biology that we're just starting to understand that do control your blood-brain barrier, but that endothelial glycocalyx and that structure can break down. Concussions, it looks like can damage it, and we don't know about the repair. Totally understand how that structure does or does not get repaired. But just generally with aging and other things, that the blood-brain barrier does break down, and that means more stuff from outside the body gets into the brain, right? That can also agitate the immune system. And the one thing we do know about diabetes is, it is very harmful to the endothelial structures of the body in general. I don't think anybody has done that, to my knowledge, like very focused research on the endothelial glycocalyx of the blood-brain barrier and diabetes, but I would guess that because it damages it in other parts of the body, that it probably gets damaged in diabetes as well. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, though, is like there are some weird metabolic changes that happen in the brain, especially in women, that we don't totally understand, where some signaling gets disrupted and women's brains almost lose the ability in certain stages of Alzheimer's to use sugar anymore as a source for the brain function, and they actually go into like a very powerful type of ketosis in the brain, believe it or not. But it's sort of like a pathological state of ketosis that the brain should not be running on ketosis in this particular case. But there's some dysfunction in the use of glycogen in the brain. So again, there's probably subtypes. So I wouldn't call it type 3 diabetes, but there's probably subtypes of Alzheimer's where it is more of a metabolic dysfunction in the brain. And then another subtype where metabolic dysfunction in the body is leading to, a second order effect of, breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, breakdown of immune function in the brain, and things like that.
So how did your study of the brain lead you to start thinking about a supplement to promote brain health?
Well, it became overwhelming to us, I think, from the research that I did, that Annelies Barron, who's this professor of bioengineering, who's part of our company, did. And also I'll mention another study. The guy who worked in my lab, who I mentioned, Ben Reedhead, he published a study, a follow-up study, maybe a year ago. It was in the news, where he basically showed the Banner Alzheimer's Institute, where he works, has a very interesting resource in that they have whole cadavers that were donated for research for Alzheimer's. Usually Alzheimer's research institutes get brain banks, so they just get the brain, but they got whole bodies. And he published a paper showing that there's a subgroup of Alzheimer's affected individuals who had a chronic cytomegalovirus infection in their gut. And cytomegalovirus is a herpes virus family. And that was causing a shift in the immune system in the gut around these immunoglobulins. And then that was transmitting up the vagus nerve from the gut into the brain, and then shifting the immune system in the brain and causing a different type of neuroinflammatory sort of liability. And I think why herpes viruses come up a lot is because they're very neurotrophic, meaning that it's easy for them to travel across the nervous system. So actually, the olfactory nerve in your nose is obviously connected to the olfactory bulb in your brain. There have been studies where they just look at that in cadavers, and there are herpes viruses all along they can move up and down your nervous system in your brain. Another reason why the brain was this hermetically sealed box that couldn't be affected by things outside the body. So understanding this sort of neurotrophic virus liability. And of course, that brought up Ben's other papers, because that connects the gut to the brain through the vagus nerve. There are other neurological liabilities, the trigeminal nerve in the mouth. It looked like things can travel from that into the brain, which is an interesting thing to talk about. But so we ended up mapping all these different immune pathways, either outside the brain or within the brain, that we thought were all sort of culminating together to increase risk of Alzheimer's over time. And then we realized that probably all these pathways that we had mapped out could be targeted with natural products. Now, what's great is mainstream biopharma has recognized that neuroinflammation is a problem, and that these microglia and other immune cells of the brain are important targets for Alzheimer's. The problem is they're attacking those pathways with traditional biopharmaceutical drug development, right? Meaning, while they're developing drugs today, it's going to be 15, 20 years before we are likely to see the outcome of that work. And even then, drugs fail a lot. So, but and of course, wish them the best on doing that. But we realized, there's a lot of natural products that can target these pathways, and we could probably find a faster path to helping people if we could target, put together a combination of natural products that hit all these different pathways that we mapped out, and that should reduce risk of Alzheimer's. But we found a bunch of natural products that we could formulate in a certain way to do that. But then we actually got stuck, because natural products have a problem. One problem is they're not very bioavailable. So you need lots of it to have the concentrations in your blood that you would need, or in your body, to have a biological effect. So sort of when we initially mapped it out, you'd probably have to take about 20, 25 pills a day to have the biological effect that we wanted. And we just knew that was not, pill fatigue is a huge issue. You're probably like me, you're probably already taking a bunch of stuff, or at least a lot of people listening to this, taking stuff, and, adding another 20, 25 pills a day to your regimen is probably not going to work. So we sat on it for a bit, and then we came across this technology, which we now use in our product today, which was an emulsion technology. And one thing that's also a challenge with natural products is they end up being very hydrophobic. So we wanted to put them into a liquid. So we ended up finding an emulsion technology that's proprietary to our product now, that allow us to put mega doses of this combination of natural products in a very small liquid shot that would stay in solution and stay shelf stable without refrigeration and things like that. So all those things sort of came together: the understanding of the biology, finding natural products we thought could fix that biology, but then finding this formulation technology to sort of put it all together in a product that would make sense for people to take.
So when because we were talking before I hit record, I'm on day 2 now of trying Bevimi. There's definitely a fish element to it, beneath the fruit flavoring. So I'm assuming that's kind of an omega-3 type angle that you're going. So without giving away the secret sauce, what are some of the elements within Bevimi, and then what is their effect on the brain health?
Well, the fish, and everybody tastes it different. Some people don't taste it at all. Some people tasted it, a hint of it. It is a fish oil, DHA and EPA, but all fish oil is not the same. There's a guy who's a part of our company, Stephen Phipps. He was a lot of the ex-Thorne, if people are familiar with the company Thorne, which makes natural products, great company. The team that basically created Thorne is the team running Bevimi now. So they really know what they're doing in this industry. And Stephen Phipps, who built all the products at Thorne, who's now building our products, he could go on and on for hours about the different types of fish oils, and how probably the fish oil you get from the store is oxidated and doesn't have all the subcomponents, because it's basically a whole array of different fatty acids and different chain fatty acids that make up fish oil. Even though we say it's EPA and DHA, the chemical components of it can be very different. So we actually use a fish oil that has very specific components, lipid components to it that we know will get into the brain and that aren't going to get oxidized and be ineffective and things like that. But it comes from this one. It actually comes from this one part of Norway. Actually, there's only one region we can get this type of fish oil, and it's the most expensive thing in our ingredient list in terms of adding to the cost of the product. But the benefits of fish oil for Alzheimer's are well understood, and it's a critical component of affecting the neuroinflammation in the brain. But this is a very special kind that's much more bioavailable and much more likely to get into the brain to do what we want to do.
I know you just published your first white paper, so talk to me about that.
Yeah, so in the white paper, we really lay out the biological rationale for, how we built the product, why we chose the ingredients. But one nice thing about this product is the ingredients are actually individually well understood and have been put in humans. So the ingredients themselves are not proprietary. Curcumin, for example, or which is a powerful anti-inflammatory thing. But what is unique about this product is the combination, the liquid formulation, and the doses of these. So most people, I hate to say, taking natural products are not taking enough to have any biological effects. So we have over, one little 1.7 ounce shot has something like over 3 grams of active ingredients. Even when you take pills, by the way, a lot of what's in that white little supplement pill you take is not the active ingredient. It's actually mostly like a filler, a cellulose filler or something like that. So even then, that's very little active ingredient. So over 3 grams of pure actives, and this is a mega dose of natural products, but it ends up being very palatable and easy on the stomach and everything because of this liquid formulation. So we're getting a very powerful biological effect. But the individual ingredients themselves are sort of understood in a lot of the biology. What's not understood is how they synergize. We think they actually, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, because we've chosen these ingredients, and the underlying biological rationale for choosing these ingredients was we believe they synergize along these biological pathways in ways, like I said, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But at least the individual ingredients have been tested in humans and have known positive biological effects. So we're launching the product based on that, but we are also launching a clinical trial to test the combination, product in humans using some sophisticated immune profiling technology and other things to really see if we can demonstrate, not only are we having the anti-inflammatory and other effects we expect from the individual components, but that the combination and the dosing that we put in this product is as powerful as we think it is.
The people listening, most of them are working shift work. They are exposed to a high level of stress. Some of them are being exposed to carcinogens in their job. Talk to me about the increased inflammation and then how this product could potentially help reduce that in the first responder.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just inflammation does so many bad things to your body, right? Like, and it's acute versus chronic. But one of the things that it tends to do is break down barriers. So we'll go back to, we talked about the blood-brain barrier. Gut barrier is another one, right? Where chronic inflammation, you have a very sophisticated barrier, and you have a special type of immune, configuration. Let's say in your gut, there's certain types of immune cells that exist in high concentrations in the gut. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because the gut is where you bring a lot of foreign material into your body, right? Because you're eating. And in fact, there's really cool studies, not to go on a tangent, where there's these systems where you can, optogenetic systems and other systems where you can activate certain parts of mouse brains. And there's studies have shown that, like, you can activate a part of the mouse brain that is basically the urge to feed, let's say. And you'll actually see when you activate that, the immune system will start to change and get ready for foreign material coming into the body. So that there's a very, unique immune configuration. I'm trying not to get too jargony about it, but let's say in your gut, which makes sense because that's where all your foreign material comes in. And it's always kind of sampling, what's going on down there. And it's what's really interesting is it talks to the commensal bacteria. Obviously, I'm sure people have talked about the microbiome, and a lot of people know about the microbiome, but there are obviously good bacteria and bad bacteria. There is a crosstalk between the microbiome and the immune system down there. They chat with each other, or they're always sampling. The immune system is always sampling and kind of seeing who's all around. And there's sort of a normal, and obviously it's looking for things like pathogens, C. difficile or other food. I was just in Portugal and had norovirus. I think I mentioned to you. So it's looking for things like norovirus to recruit a stronger immune response if it needs to. But the point is, it's learning a lot about how to react to things by constantly sampling things in your gut. And when the gut barrier is disrupted and breaks down, that process gets distorted, and that's how you start to get things like food allergies and other sorts of things, because the immune system kind of can't go through its normal learning as that barrier breaks down. Why I'm bringing that up in this case is because some of the things in our drink are to directly address inflammation in the brain, but it's also to address broadly inflammation. The drink itself should be extremely powerful anti-inflammatory. We're not making claims towards this, but I would expect anybody who, like me, who deals with like osteoarthritis and things like that will start. I've already started to perceive some benefits, from it. And these ingredients are used in some arthritis supplements and things like that. But it's important to address the inflammation in the brain specifically, which we do. But it's important to address inflammation in the body because of things like this barrier breakdown in your gut, this barrier breakdown in your blood-brain barrier. So, and once that you put out the flame of that inflammation, there are other processes that can come in and start to fix things. But we're on to use maybe a pandering to the crowd analogy, though. You got to put the fire out, before you start the repair.
I think it's really interesting because I saw the impact, on my own health, whether, like you said, from the joint pain to the GI distress, and then even, going back to the COVID conversation, when we have something like that happen, we're asking the most sleep-deprived populations to hold the front line while everyone else, stays at home. So the ability to supplement and actually try and get ahead of some of these things, whether it's, like I said, the gut health or even long-term ill health of the brain, I think it's a really, really exciting, potentially, innovating product for us.
Yeah. When one anecdote I'll share from my personal health is I think we still generally underappreciate how much the immune system affects our just general cognition and our ability to have executive function and memory and things like that. I have Crohn's disease, which is autoimmune basic condition of the intestines. I got to a point, which is common in people with Crohn's, where there was so much damage to my intestine, I was basically becoming septic, and my inflammation was sky high. And I eventually had to go to the ER and get part of my intestines removed, which is common in people with Crohn's. But I was sitting at home having dinner, and I have two children, and I knew something was off with my gut, and I wasn't feeling very good. But I remember looking at my son and going, I know that's my son, but I have no idea what his name is. And then I remember thinking, oh crap! So I told my wife, I'm like, something's really wrong. I don't know his name. And she's like, who? I'm like, I don't know his name, our son. And so I go to the hospital and I get my CRP measured, HSCRP, and mine was like 70, and like the high range for that is like 7. So I was like 10x the high range. And basically what was happening is I had so much infection and inflammation in my gut, I was becoming septic. It was starting to perforate through the outside of the bowel. But I remember talking to the GI doctor, who was a very famous GI doctor at Mount Sinai. And I said, his name is Bruce. He was a friend of mine. I said, Bruce, the symptom that brought me in here actually wasn't the gut pain, because I always have gut pain. It was the memory loss. And he goes, oh, we hear that all the time from the patients, that they lose their memory when the inflammation's high. And I'm like, oh, you do? That's interesting. I go, well, what happens? He goes, oh, we give them steroids and their memory comes back. And then we just send them on their way. There was no curiosity to follow, because they're so stuck in their part of medicine. It's not necessarily that they didn't have the curiosity. There's just no way for them to follow that and that curiosity, even if they had it. And it just drove me crazy that they had heard this on a regular basis, that inflammation causes people to lose their memory. And they just treated the steroids, their memory comes back, and they send them on their way. And, nobody publishes a paper about it. Nobody follows up on it. It's just so frustrating. And the reason I bring that up is, and I think also what long COVID, sort of showed us, I don't think there's anything special, by the way, about COVID and brain fog. I think lots of viruses cause brain fog, and that was underappreciated. And I think COVID just brought that to the forefront. So we treat long COVID and COVID brain as something special. But I would bet you that respiratory viruses in general lead to a sequela of persistent brain inflammation that's probably been underappreciated in the past, which we maybe over attribute to COVID, but is probably a bigger problem than we realize. So I think what I'm trying to bring up is this, you might think about neuroinflammation for, maybe it's my long-term risk of Alzheimer's 20 years down the road. No, I think the evidence points to executive function, memory, making decisions, all being affected by inflammation, which probably anybody like me who has bad seasonal allergies knows. My IQ gets cut in half when I think my IQ is inversely proportional to the pollen count. But so that's also a hope with this product, right? That is that those shorter term benefits around executive function and memory we have to prove it, but should improve as neuroinflammation goes down, in addition to these longer term risks.
Well, this is the other side of the conversation with the first responders. There's no doubt in my mind that for their long-term health, these work weeks need to be shorter. They need to have, and when I say shorter, it's 42 hours a week. It's the same as the person in the bank and the coffee shop and everyone else. But, there's a lot of resistance to it. But when you also think that these men and women wake up from a dead sleep at 3 a.m, slide down a pole, get into an emergency vehicle, drive lights and sirens, throw a ladder, go into a burning building, pull someone out, and then maybe have to do a cardiac algorithm. The importance of executive function is imperative. It literally lives, are at stake. So the shift work, the ability to get rest and recovery between shifts is imperative. But if there are other things that we can also add in, it's the long-term, health, the lifespan is obviously very, very important. But as you said, the ability to simply do our job, to not push the wrong med, to not miss, the trachea when we're intubating. These are massive, massive elements of our profession.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. And, like we talked about before, obviously the circadian disruption is going to have a disruption on the normal sort of ebb and flow of the immune system, throughout the day. And, and when the immune system gets out of sync, it tends to just get upset. It sort of defaults to, I'm not, something's not functioning right, in terms of the signals I'm getting. So I'm just going to get mad, and I'm going to crank up, baseline inflammation, or like hyperreact to things, so it's another reason to make sure that the fire in the brain and the body doesn't get out of control with the inflammation.
Total tangent. Have you ever heard of Newcom?
No, I have not.
So it is a very, very long story, very short. It is an app that you can get now. Used to be a massive $6,000 box in naval special warfare and NFL locker rooms.
Okay.
But now it's an app on the phone, and basically it down regulates the nervous system through sound. So you put on a sleep mask, you listen to this, what you think is music, but beneath the music is a gig of these, undulating noises. And it's the only one that's got a patent of this technology, but it is incredible. And again, this is another way to kind of down regulate, to kind of get a version of a 90-minute sleep. And for a first responder to leave a fire station, do one of these sessions and then go home in a much better mindset as they walk through the door. So it's really interesting seeing, whether we're talking supplementation, whether we're talking, the technology that we talked about earlier is now able to down regulate, a soldier or a police officer, that there are these tools out there now, but you've got to find them amongst all the white noise of commercialism.
Yeah. No, that's a good point to bring back up too. There's a very, very famous Stanford professor who's, I think, made the rounds on lots of the big podcasts, named Robert Sapolsky. He was I took his class when I was a student at Stanford. He's an amazing guy, but he has this very famous book why zebras don't get ulcers, which talks a lot about stress and the immune system. But he has done some recent work that is worth, for people interested in that, following up on, chronic stress and vigilance and things like that, and how that relates to the neuroendocrine system and just the hormonal systems and how that interplays with the immune system. All these things are connected, right? So, but he's a real interesting guy, to go try to find podcasts on, just if you want to pull out that thread a bit more about how, vigilance and stress and all these sort of things can contribute to long-term immune dysfunction.
Absolutely. Well, the product Bevimi, when is it going to be released and how can people find it?
Well, we have we're launching soon e-commerce. I think roughly 2 weeks from now. I should be prepared with the exact date, and hopefully we can put that in after the fact. That's what happens when you talk to the science guy and not the marketing guy, or gal in our case. Coming out, and initially just available online. And you asked me another question. I apologize. I just totally blanked on it.
Where can people find it? So what would be the website they would order from?
So our main website is mybevimi.com. And basically, if you go there now, you're not going to see anything though, but you'll be able to get on a list, when the site goes live. So there'll be a switch that gets flipped, and you can order directly from mybevimi.com. And there should be a lot more information up there too, in terms of more about the science and biology, underlying what we're doing here. We're also trying to keep on top of just, we just feel so fortunate that, we think this is the right product at the right time in terms of where science is going. And, we can barely keep up now with all the papers coming out on neuroinflammation and Alzheimer's and other diseases. So we're also going to try to, keep people, or provide resources to people who are just interested in the science and biology here of neuroinflammation and obviously how we're targeting it, but just more generally, because I think it's really fascinating, this whole immune system of the brain, because it's been so underappreciated for so long. And like everything else in the brain, how it works is just miraculous and interesting. And we're just beginning to understand how it works.
You mentioned earlier about the HPV vaccine. For people listening, what would be your recommendations coming from an Alzheimer's lens on getting that vaccine? I know it was offered to my son, for example, when he was younger.
I meant this is HSV, not HPV.
Sorry,
HSV,
HSV.
so Shingrix. Yeah, Shingrix vaccine, for example. I think overall positive on the Shingrix vaccine, and there's, like I said, really interesting. Again, it's observational research. It's not randomized controlled trials on lower risk of Alzheimer's in patients who do get the age, sex, risk matched cohorts. If you get the Shingrix vaccine, that you have less chance of getting Alzheimer's, and that, which perfectly matches the biology we see in terms of what we're targeting with our product. So I would suggest that as recommended by medical professionals today. It's a bit of a doozy, I think, though I haven't gotten it yet myself. I think it's 50 and older, and I turn 50 later this year, so I'll have to think about that then. But I would recommend that one.
Brilliant. All right. Well, I want to throw a few closing questions at you before I let you go, if you've got time. First one I love to ask, and you mentioned one already. Is there a book, or are there books that you love to recommend? It can be related to our discussion today or completely unrelated.
I'm going to keep going back to my hero, David Deutsch, who's a physicist. He wrote a book called, if you want a book that upgrades your brain and how you think more than anything, he wrote a book called The Beginning of Infinity, which is probably one of the greatest books ever written in terms of just how to think. But and I'll admit it's very dense, and he's a quantum physicist. But it's really about knowledge and epistemology. And what's really cool about it is he was trying to solve fundamental problems in physics around quantum gravity and things like that. And then he realized, well, in order to do that, our philosophy, epistemology is theory of knowledge. And, our cultural operating systems and theory of knowledge and everything have to be just right in order for me to solve quantum gravity. So it's not like he was a kind of a woo-woo philosopher who was thinking about knowledge and philosophy and then trying to find examples to justify it. No, he's a hardcore, he may win the Nobel Prize someday he basically wrote the first paper on quantum computing and the first quantum computing algorithm. But he has some actually really great TED Talks that are there's one that's 17 years old. It's called Chemical Scum, That Dream of Distant Quasars, which is it's really old and it's still really relevant, where Stephen Hawking had this very pessimistic phrase, that humans are just, the chemical scum on a typical planet, in a typical solar system, and a typical, very pessimistic. And basically David Deutsch just eviscerates, that entire thing in a very optimistic way and really shows how, unique and interesting how humans think is. But it's actually very applicable to just how to think about the world in general. But it's dense. It's a dense book. It's written by a physicist. So there are podcasts, that David Deutsch has done that I highly recommend searching for, where he kind of summarizes some of it. Interestingly enough, he was actually on the Tim Ferriss podcast with Naval Ravikant, where he got to talk a bit about, which he was an odd guest, a physicist, but as maybe a gateway drug to him. So I can't talk enough about, that book and David Deutsch. But so that'd be my top answer.
Brilliant. Actually, Tim Ferriss was one of the inspirations for me starting this podcast. So
nice.
I listened to him for a long time. All right. Well, then what about television, film, or documentaries that you love?
I'm not, the most formative show I ever watched in my life will be Star Trek: The Next Generation. That's shaped my worldview dramatically. It was the best Star Trek because it was so rigorous and thinking through these interesting scenarios, and the science behind it was good. And it's actually interesting. It's so relevant today. There's an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation where they basically just tried to determine if Data is a person. Data is the android, the synthetic person. And he basically goes on trial. And I think Riker, who's the second in command, ends up being his lawyer. But if you actually go back and watch that episode and listen to the arguments being made, they are so unbelievably sophisticated and relevant to AI and what people worry about with AGI today. It's unbelievable, for basically a TV show that was kind of not meant to be as rigorous as it was. So that that was a very formative show for me. Movies, I don't really watch movies and things that much. I'm kind of boring that way, but I'm a sucker for Coen Brothers movies. I love The Big Lebowski and I quote it nonstop. So I get kind of annoying with that, but
I've had a few conversations with people about AI recently, and obviously that's a broad term as well that covers a spectrum of things, and some people kind of misunderstanding, what it actually is. What are the elements of AI that excite you, and what, if any, are some of the dangers of AI?
The parts that excite me is, a lot of, and there's two different things. There's AI and there's AGI. And those are two very different concepts that constantly get conflated. So I think it's important to separate those. But AI, as we use it today, which are obviously ChatGPT, Claude. For coding, I probably have I'm looking over at my desk right now. I probably have 10 different codecs, which is OpenAI's version of Claude Code and coding sessions. I'm building software like crazy. And software is getting built for me while I sleep. And, I do understand how code works a little bit, but I'm not writing any code. I'm just coming up with ideas and I'm able to articulate it properly. And I know enough about how software works that, but I'm just building all kinds of useful things for myself, and for Bevimi, right? And while I sleep, these coding agents are just building software the cost of software has gone to zero. And it's been democratized to where, I have a friend who's an HVAC professional who's building the most amazing software. He's taken a computer science course in his life, but he spent the time to get to know Claude Code, and he's building websites and tools and things for himself. And I think that unleashes a huge amount of creativity and a huge amount of value. And I think that's overall going to be positive for the economy, for humanity, etc. The downsides of AI, I'm not worried about at all. The dystopian, Skynet, AGI is going to kill us all. I think that's, artificial superintelligence, I think, is just a bad religion. I don't think it actually makes sense the way people describe it. And I could give a whole talk on that. I think it's prophecy more than science. But the one thing that would guarantee a bad outcome, in my opinion, for AI is if we do have very powerful AIs and they're overregulated to the point where there's only one or two of them. That's the doom. That's the doom scenario. The anti-fragile scenario, in my opinion, is when it's not overregulated and basically everybody has access to it, right? So you could say, oh, well, maybe there's some bad actors that are going to use AI to come up with a novel virus, engineer a virus to cause a pandemic. Well, if there's only like one or two very powerful AIs and the bad actors are the only ones with access to it, well, that's really bad. But if there's millions and millions of AIs and I have my AI agent that works with me and does stuff for me and you have yours, well, for every bad actor, there's a good actor, right? So as fast as they come up with the pandemic virus thing, the good people with AI can come up with the cure or the drug or the whatever, right? So the doom scenario. This is ironic because if you look at certain politicians like Bernie Sanders and others who want to overregulate, not trying to be partisan, he just happens to be one of the loud ones that want to overregulate AI because they're afraid of it. Well, that's the irony is that by overregulating it and only allowing a few privileged people to build AIs, you actually almost guarantee the doom scenario they're trying to avoid. Whereas if you empower people with the right to compute and have their own AIs, that's the anti-fragile system. If you have a community of millions of AIs, because there will be some bad people who use AI and some good people that use AI. There may be some bad aligned AIs and some good aligned AIs, but that's how you protect against the dystopian futures I think everybody's worried about. So that'd be my answer to that.
There seems to be a lot of parallels between that and wealth and power and
Yes,
the number of parties and
absolutely.
that kind of thing. So
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, then the next question, is there a person that you recommend to come on this show as a guest to speak to the first responders, military, and associated professions of the world?
Oh, I absolutely can. He's one of my good friends. His name's Chris Mason. He's a professor at Weill Cornell School of Medicine. He would be a great guest for the show. He's actually, loosely affiliated with Bevimi as well, to be transparent. But he actually, and you can actually go see him he did the Lex Friedman podcast, and we can definitely get him to come on this show. And I'll tell you why it'd be very interesting. It's because Chris is doing a lot of work around space medicine and space biology. So you might remember there was some scientific research studies done it was called the NASA Twin Study, where Scott Kelly and one of the went into space. I can't remember which Kelly went into space. One of the Kelly twins went into space. One stayed on Earth, and then a bunch of astronauts. And they did really cool stuff, like measuring a lot of genetic and proteomic changes, very deep profiling of these astronauts. And they basically built a molecular map of like what happens to human bodies in space. And Chris has continued a lot of this space biology work, and he actually wrote a book called The Next 500 Years, and about like engineering humans for space travel and all kinds of stuff. But what's really interesting about it is it's really about the human biology in extreme, environments, right? And like what happens to the body in certain types of extreme environments, and space being one sort of extreme environment, and how now people are thinking about engineering solutions to this, right? And on top of it, Chris is really, 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 really funny. So he's probably the funniest scientist I know. So, and he's also, him and I are both from Wisconsin. So,
yeah, he sounds brilliant. I just had, I don't know if you ever met Ken Ford. He's head of IHMC. So they do a lot with NASA as well.
Oh, I know the name.
Talking about the exact thing. Like, yeah, you could get someone to Mars, but you'd never get them back, for example. That'd have to be a one-way mission. So hearing from that world,
right,
like deeply in that world, it just reframes again all the kind of dystopian doom and gloom, or, that we're not there yet for some of the Star Wars stuff either.
Well, and Chris did a really cool, and not to keep belabor the point, but Chris actually did a really cool study in the past which is called like the metropolome. He's just a big thinker. And he actually sequenced did microbiome sequencing of all the New York City subway system. So almost and he's done a lot of like microbiome sequencing of the built environment. And he has lots of interesting things to say about like how like the microbiome of a city changes, in response to hurricanes and floods and, what that means for human health and stuff like that. So it's a really, really, really cool stuff. I think that, people who watch the show would find interesting.
Absolutely. All right, we'll definitely make that happen. Thank you so much. The very last question then, before we make sure everyone knows where to find you and Bevimi.
Yeah.
What do you do to decompress?
What do I do to decompress? Well, I love hiking. I love snowboarding for physical activities. But I don't know. It's pretty, I'm a nerd. So like, I like to write, if I'm interested in a topic, I'll like write a paper about it. Like I'm really interested in abiogenesis right now. Abiogenesis is like how did life on Earth exist? And there's theories around RNA world, and it's not related to anything I'm working on, but I'm just curious about it. So this is like a terrible answer and it makes me sound weird, but I'll write random papers on things I'm interested in for myself that nobody else will ever read, to just learn about it. So that's what I do to decompress, which is kind of weird. But snowboarding and hiking too. And I live in Colorado, which is one of the most beautiful places to hike. So,
are you a spiritual person as well? Do you believe in any sort of higher power?
I'm not a religious person, I would say. I don't know if I'm a spiritual person, but I'm in awe of, I spent a lot of time in physics and trying to understand the nature of reality. It's one of my biggest topics I'm interested in, which is why I love David Deutsch so much. And I'm in awe of humans. I think humans are so amazing and so special. Contrary to the Malthusians, the Greta Thunbergs of the world and others who think that humans are a scourge on the planet or whatever. It's actually the opposite when you really try to understand how special, when you really realize how unique and special humans are, not only on the planet, but probably, in the universe. So the reason I bring that up is, like, oddly enough, I don't consider myself a spiritual person or a religious person, but end up coming to some very parallel conclusions about the uniqueness and specialness of humans in the universe. So it's kind of odd how that worked out.
Well, you hear this more and more. The faith-based and the science-based used to be kind of World War II trenches a long time ago, and then it's kind of come full circle now where they're standing side by side in a lot of areas. And I'm talking about faith versus extreme religion. That's a whole different conversation.
Well, yeah. I'm very interested in epistemology, what I mentioned before, and human knowledge. And one of the most amazing things about human beings as a species is, basically the way knowledge accumulated before humans was through the genome. The genome actually accumulates knowledge, right? Like encodes information on how to do things in the world, like for species, like how to eat things, how to process things, how to move, how to react. But humans changed the game completely from a hardware game into a software game. And basically humans started accumulating knowledge in culture and software, and no other species can do that. Like, Catholics in Italy and in Argentina can coordinate their behavior across great geographies because they share a culture and a story, and no other species can do that. You can't take zebras, in two different parts of the planet and have them coordinate their behavior across geography. So because I'm very interested in human evolution, the evolution of human intelligence, you realize how powerful culture is an operating system. And then you start to look back at history. Well, there are many amazing things that happened. Just to get back to the science and religion thing, like there were so many innovations that, for example, Judaism and Christianity introduced into the human cultural operating system that you can look at objectively, even though I'm not a Christian or Jewish or anything, but you can objectively look at those and say, oh, these are like innovations, right, in the cultural operating system. Like these were code upgrades that allowed humans to do all these really amazing things. So I guess I bring it up. It's like you can be, I guess, an objective sort of atheist like me and still have reverence for these cultural OS upgrades that came from these operating systems are like really substantial and really led to the Enlightenment or at least created a pathway towards things like the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and things like that allow us to be sophisticated as we are today. So, so it's complicated.
Well, it's interesting because I'm spiritual. I don't align with any one religion, and I really just try and look at the Venn diagram where it overlaps. And I would make a case for the fact that man's true evolution is towards kindness and compassion and community. And if you take, for example, the Bible, Old Testament is like, here's what not to do. Like eye for an eye doesn't work.
Right.
We end up killing each other. And so here's this, Jesus is born, and we have this forgiveness and turning the other cheek and anointing the weak and all that kind of thing. And so I feel like when you get pulled towards religious extremism, you're actually going against the teachings. You're going against the evolution of man. And the more that we can lean into these lessons of the ancient, whether it's, the Stoicism or whether it's a religious doctrine, I think that actually is our next step. Our next kind of chapter is when we start coming together and stop, these genocides and these massacres and these other things that the history books have shown us is not the right way to go.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a certain type of dogmatism that is particularly deadly, in my opinion, which is moral certainty. And, and you see it on, moral certainty on both ends of the political spectrum has led to the deaths of millions to hundreds of millions of people. But, and I think this is where, from my, I keep talking about David Deutsch, but he's a follower or he's a fan of, there's this Austrian scientist or philosopher of science called Karl Popper. People might have come across him in school, and they often attribute him to being the person who came up with like falsification as a aspect of science. But that's only a very limited view into what he was talking about, because you can come up with all kinds of bad theories that can be falsified because they're nonsense. So falsification in and of itself is not required for good progress in science. But the goal is never not to be right. I always say my goal in life is to be less wrong all the time, and knowing that we're always wrong. So for example, like Newton was wrong, and we only know Newton was wrong because Einstein and special and general relativity ended up replacing Newton's theories, right? But so it's not like relativity is the right, general and special relativity is the right, that theory. It's the least wrong theory we have right now. But we know it's probably wrong because we don't have a theory of quantum gravity that reconciles the quantum physics world with the world of quantum physics with the world of, planetary motion and bending of space-time by planets and planet gravities and things like that. That's in general and special relativity. So it's like right, but we know it's wrong. But so I guess I prefer like a stance of epistemic humility. Is like my goal in life is just to be less wrong, to constantly try to be less wrong, not to try to be right. So,
yeah, I like that too. And again, listening to lessons of the history, having the humility to figure out what's the next level. All right. Well, then for people listening, let's just reiterate one more time where they can find Bevimi. And then if they want to reach out to you, where are the best places to do that online?
Yeah, I guess Bevimi, again, is mybevimi.com, and the site will go live soon. In terms of reaching out to me, I do have a Twitter X handle, J Dudley. I'm not super active on there, but I am active on there sometimes. Would love for anybody to reach out to me there. And LinkedIn, I've got a profile. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to take a message from anybody on LinkedIn. And I have of course, a Bevimi email. Everybody's allowed to, or would be welcome to email me at too, which I think is, this is terrible, you don't know your own email. I think it's jdudley at mybevimi.com, but I'll confirm that actually. Brilliant. Without spending time looking it up now. I feel like I should know that.
Yeah. Well, Joe, I want to say thank you so much. It's been such an interesting conversation. We've gone on a bunch of tangents, which I think is Brilliant. I mean, the conversation about Bevimi was imperative, and I think it's really exciting to see, the impact of that on, my population, on the first responders, but also exploring AI and genes and, reflecting on COVID, I think has been invaluable. So I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
No, thank you. And I want to thank you for indulging my ADHD and allowing me to connect across all these topics, which I enjoy thoroughly. So the pleasure is all mine.